There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, when the machinery of empires grinds to a halt and the men who commanded millions find themselves suddenly, terrifyingly alone. May 8, 1945 was such a moment. As dawn broke over Central Europe that morning, smoke still rose from Berlin's shattered boulevards. The Reich Chancellery, where Adolf Hitler had commanded an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, lay in ruins. In bunkers and command posts across what remained of Nazi Germany, field telephones rang with the same message, repeated in increasingly desperate tones: cease all military operations. The war was over. Consider for a moment what this meant. In 6 years, Germany had mobilized 17 million men, conquered most of Europe, and fought on 3 continents. Now, in the span of hours, that entire military structure collapsed like a building whose foundations had been removed. 3 million Allied soldiers, representing armies from 26 nations, found themselves tasked with an unprecedented challenge: locate and secure every general officer of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. 247 men who had commanded this vast machine of war. 247 minds that held the secrets of how Germany had nearly conquered a continent. History's greatest manhunt had begun. In a farmhouse outside Munich, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood before a mirror in his bedroom. He was 63 years old, a career soldier who had served Germany for 44 years. His uniform, tailored in Berlin during the Reich Zenith, bore the weight of his service, the Knight's Cross at his throat, the Iron Cross ribbons across his chest, the gold braid of his rank gleaming even in the dim morning light. His hands moved slowly as he began to remove the medals one by one. Each piece of metal represented a campaign, a decision, a moment when he had shaped the course of the war. Now they meant something else entirely: evidence. Outside he could hear them coming. American tanks, their engines creating a low rumble that carried across the Bavarian countryside. 5 miles away, perhaps less. He had commanded armies that stretched across continents, coordinated operations involving millions of men. He knew precisely what 5 miles meant to a mechanized column moving through undefended territory. Less than an hour, Keitel folded the uniform carefully, as he had been trained to do as a young lieutenant half a century earlier. Some habits persist even when the world around them crumbles. He dressed in civilian clothes that felt strange against his skin, then sat down to wait. There was nowhere left to run. 700 miles to the north, in Norway, General Alfred Jodl faced a different kind of ending. As chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht, he had spent 4 years transforming Hitler's visions into executable military orders. Every major campaign, every strategic decision had passed through his hands. The documentation of those choices now filled 3 filing cabinets in the headquarters, where he had worked for the final months of the war. He burned them systematically, feeding papers into a cast-iron stove while his aides stood at the window, listening for aircraft. The documents caught fire reluctantly, as if the weight of history made them resistant to destruction. Operational plans for Norway's defense, casualty reports from the Eastern Front, communications regarding the treatment of prisoners and partisans. Each page curled and blackened, its information dissolving into ash and smoke. But Jodl was a meticulous man, trained in staff procedures that demanded multiple copies, proper filing, redundant records. For every document he burned in Norway, 2 more existed in Berlin, 3 more in field headquarters across Europe. You cannot erase history simply by feeding it to flames. The paper might burn, but the decisions those documents recorded had already written themselves into the world in blood and ruins. Across the collapsing Reich, in hundreds of locations, similar scenes unfolded. Generals confronted the end of the only world they had known. Some chose dignity, others chose denial. A few chose desperation. In Prague, General Ferdinand Schörner, commander of Army Group Center, attempted something extraordinary. He removed his rank insignia, donned the uniform of a common soldier, and tried to disappear into the chaos of refugees flooding westward. a field marshal responsible for 800,000 men pretending to be a private. He made it 12 miles before Czech partisans, who had learned to recognize the bearing of command, regardless of the uniform that bore it, pulled him from a truck and handed him to Soviet forces. In Hamburg, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named as his successor in his final testament, maintained a bizarre fiction. He established what he called the Flensburg government, conducting cabinet meetings and issuing orders as if Germany still existed as a functioning state. Allied forces allowed this performance to continue for 23 days, finding it useful to have someone with apparent authority who could coordinate the surrender of scattered naval units and U-boats. On May 23rd, British soldiers arrested the entire government during a routine cabinet session. The last act of the Third Reich ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with bureaucratic efficiency. The transformation happened with stunning speed. Commanders who had breakfast in fortified headquarters ate dinner in detention camps. The men who had ruled Europe found themselves subject to rules they had never imagined applied to them. But locating these men required more than sending soldiers to known headquarters. The Wehrmacht's general staff represented the most sophisticated military minds of their generation. They understood logistics, operational security, the importance of controlling information. If they chose to vanish, they would not make it easy. The Allied intelligence services deployed every tool available. Radio triangulation units swept the frequency spectrum, listening for the distinctive patterns of military communications. Any radio that transmitted with proper encryption protocols, any signal that followed German military timing schedules, warranted investigation. Chemical laboratories analyzed documents for signs of forgery, the type of ink used, the aging of paper, the characteristic impressions of specific typewriters. Some generals tried to create false identities using genuine Wehrmacht paperwork stolen from destroyed headquarters. The forgers did excellent work, but no forger could perfectly replicate the bureaucratic ecosystem of military paperwork. The cross-references and filing numbers and signature patterns that made each document part of a larger system. Perhaps most remarkably, primitive computing machines, massive assemblies of electromechanical relays that filled entire rooms, began cross-referencing millions of refugee records. Every person moving through Allied checkpoints had their information recorded: name, age, place of origin, military service history. The machines looked for patterns, men of the right age claiming service ranks that made no sense. Refugees from East Prussia who spoke with Bavarian accents. Former corporals whose hands showed no evidence of manual labor. The human mind cannot hold and compare millions of data points simultaneously. But these early computers, ancestors of the machines that would transform the world, could identify anomalies that marked men trying to hide in plain sight. The interrogators discovered similar patterns across the 52 prisoners. These were not monsters in any conventional sense. Many showed normal or above-average intelligence. They expressed love for their families, appreciation for music and literature, concern for Germany's suffering. They were, in most respects, recognizably human, which made their crimes all the more disturbing. The ecosystem of captivity created its own hierarchies and alliances. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine had always maintained separate identities, competing for resources and prestige. That rivalry continued behind barbed wire, but with a bitter new dimension. Each branch sought to establish that they, at least, had fought honorably. The Luftwaffe generals blamed the army for Germany's defeat. If only the ground forces had held their positions, they argued, air superiority would have delivered victory. The army commanders countered that the Luftwaffe had failed to protect German cities from Allied bombing, had squandered resources on prestige projects while frontline units lacked basic supplies. The naval officers maintained an air of superiority over both, insisting that the Kriegsmarine had conducted warfare according to international law, that their U-boat campaign, while brutal, fell within accepted military practice. These arguments played out during recreation hours, when the prisoners were allowed to mingle in the hotel's former dining room. Some played chess, with pieces carved from Red Cross soap bars, patient work done with improvised tools during the long, empty hours. The ivory and ebony sets they had once used in Berlin and Munich were gone, replaced by these crude white figures that bore only approximate resemblance to knights and bishops. Watch them play, these generals moving soap pieces across makeshift boards. Each game becomes a microscopic reenactment of the strategies that failed them. Blitzkrieg tactics translated to aggressive openings that sacrifice material for tempo. Soviet-style defense in depth rendered as patient, grinding endgames. They cannot help but fight the war again, cannot stop analyzing where the mistakes occurred, which moves doomed their campaigns. General Erich von Manstein, considered by many to be the Wehrmacht's finest strategic mind, played chess with elegant precision. He had commanded armies in the invasion of France, orchestrated the conquest of Crimea, and directed the failed relief attempt at Stalingrad. Now he demonstrated the same gift for spatial reasoning and long-term planning in games that lasted hours, sometimes days. His opponents studied these matches carefully, trying to understand how his mind worked, how he calculated advantage and assessed risk. Some prisoners adapted to captivity with remarkable flexibility. Von Manstein began writing legal briefs defending his conduct during the war, applying his analytical abilities to jurisprudence with the same systematic approach he had once used for campaign planning. He assembled evidence methodically, interviewed fellow prisoners about events he had not personally witnessed, constructed arguments about the distinction between military necessity and criminal action. The man who had planned operations involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers now organized paragraphs and precedents with equal precision. Others broke under the weight of what they faced. General Edward Wagner, the Wehrmacht's quartermaster general, had overseen the logistical systems that supplied German forces across Europe. He knew, better than almost anyone, the truth about the final solution. His office had coordinated transport for concentration camp supplies, had routed resources to Einsatzgruppen death squads, had kept the machinery of genocide functioning with the same efficiency applied to feeding armies. When American investigators began examining his records, connecting his signatures to specific atrocities, Wagner realized he could construct no defense that would save him. He shot himself in June of 1945, before formal charges could be filed. Unlike Keitel, with his latrines, or Dönitz with his potatoes, Wagner could not transform himself to meet this new reality. Some trees bend in storms, others break. Wagner broke. The detention camps became laboratories for understanding warfare at the highest level. Allied intelligence officers approached their subjects with the systematic curiosity of naturalists documenting a newly discovered species. How does the Wehrmacht make decisions? What communication systems coordinate armies across thousands of miles? How do commanders balance competing objectives, allocate scarce resources, maintain discipline under catastrophic conditions? The prisoners, isolated from each other during formal interrogations, told their stories. Some spoke freely, eager to demonstrate their military competence, their professional excellence, their success in what they still viewed primarily as a test of strategic skill. Others remained silent or provided only the minimum information required by the Geneva Conventions: name, rank, serial number. A few lied, spinning elaborate fabrications to conceal their involvement in specific operations. But the interrogators had time and leverage. They could cross-reference testimonies, compare accounts of the same events from different perspectives, identify contradictions that revealed deception. They could show prisoners documents with their own signatures, confront them with orders they had issued, present evidence that made denial impossible. Over months of interrogation, 8 million pages of testimony accumulated. The sheer volume of documentation created its own kind of truth. No individual could control the narrative when hundreds of witnesses provided overlapping, intersecting accounts. The fog of war lifted, revealing the machinery of military decision-making in unprecedented detail. Investigators learned how modern nations waged total war. They documented the Wehrmacht's logistical systems, how many tons of supplies an armored division required per day, how rail transport was prioritized, where bottlenecks occurred that determined the pace of offensive operations. They extracted tactical knowledge, the optimal deployment of artillery, the coordination of air and ground forces, the methods for breaking through fortified positions. They mapped command structures, who reported to whom, how orders traveled from Hitler's headquarters to frontline units, where individual commanders exercised initiative and where they simply followed directives. But beneath these professional details lay darker knowledge. The interrogations revealed how military institutions rationalized collaboration with criminal policies. Generals explained, with varying degrees of honesty, how they had reconciled their professional ethics with orders to execute prisoners, to implement collective punishment against civilian populations, to support SS operations in occupied territories. Some claimed ignorance. They had focused on military operations, they insisted, and knew nothing of concentration camps or execution squads. This defense collapsed when investigators produced documents showing these commanders had been briefed on anti-partisan operations that killed tens of thousands of civilians, had signed orders implementing collective reprisals, had coordinated logistics for units they now claimed to know nothing about. Others admitted knowledge but claimed powerlessness. They had opposed Hitler's criminal orders, they said, but could not refuse without being relieved of command or worse. This argument carried more weight, though investigators noted how selectively these generals had chosen which orders to oppose. Objections to tactically questionable operations appeared frequently in military records. Objections to atrocities far less so. A few acknowledged their complicity directly. They had believed in the mission, in defending Europe from Bolshevism, in Germany's right to living space in the East. The cruelties, they admitted, seemed justified by the stakes involved. These confessions proved most useful to investigators, not because they excused the crimes, but because they revealed the thought processes that made such crimes possible. Consider the transformation this represents. These men had commanded from positions of absolute authority. Their orders moved armies, determined the fate of cities, shaped the outcome of campaigns affecting millions of lives. They had lived in the realm of grand strategy, where individual human suffering disappeared into statistical abstractions, casualty rates, civilian displacement figures, acceptable losses. Now they sat in small rooms, across tables from Allied officers, and confronted the specific consequences of those abstract decisions. Investigators showed them photographs of massacred villages, played testimony from survivors, presented forensic evidence linking their units to specific atrocities. The shield of strategic distance dissolved. The generals could no longer hide behind military necessity or superior orders. They had to account for themselves as individuals, as moral agents responsible for their choices. Some made that accounting honestly. Most did not. But either way, the process continued, patient and systematic, extracting knowledge and assigning responsibility in preparation for the trials that would follow. By late summer of 1945, the detention system had expanded far beyond Camp Ashcan. Additional facilities across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories held hundreds more Wehrmacht officers. The total prisoner population swelled to include not just generals, but colonels, majors, staff officers whose specialized knowledge made them valuable sources of intelligence. The work of interrogation and documentation continued with methodical intensity. Every day added thousands more pages to the growing archive. The emerging picture showed an institution, the Wehrmacht, that had been simultaneously professional and criminal, sophisticated and barbaric, bound by traditional military codes while participating in unprecedented atrocities. This paradox would define everything that followed. In the courtrooms, where justice would be attempted, in the Cold War calculations that would offer some generals redemption. In the historical debates that continue today, the fundamental question remains: how does professional military excellence coexist with moral catastrophe? How do we judge men who demonstrated tactical brilliance while serving strategic evil? The metamorphosis behind barbed wire began answering these questions, not with simple condemnation or easy forgiveness, but with the patient accumulation of evidence, the systematic documentation of decision-making under extreme circumstances, the attempt to understand how the mechanisms of modern warfare can transform ordinary military officers into participants in genocide. The chrysalis does not reveal what emerges until the transformation completes. In those detention camps, something new was taking shape, not just judgments about individuals, but frameworks for holding military commanders accountable that would reshape the laws of war for generations to come. There are moments when humanity attempts to rewrite its own rules, when the accumulated horror of events demands new language, new frameworks, new ways of understanding responsibility itself. Courtroom 600 in Nuremberg, Germany, became such a moment, a stage where 24 men faced judgment for crimes that had required the invention of new words to describe them. The room itself spoke of deliberate symbolism. The Palace of Justice had survived Allied bombing largely intact, while the city around it lay in ruins. In the courtroom, workers installed advanced translation systems, the first time simultaneous interpretation would be used in a major trial. 4 languages, English, French, Russian, and German, would flow through headphones in real time, allowing every participant to follow proceedings in their native tongue. Technology served justice, ensuring that no defendant could claim misunderstanding, that no nuance would be lost to linguistic barriers. For 218 days, from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, the world watched. 24 defendants sat in 2 rows, flanked by white-helmeted military police. Among them, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, the architects of Nazi Germany's military and political machinery, now reduced to defendants in prisoner's dock. The prosecution faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you try men for crimes that were not clearly illegal when committed? International law, such as it existed, focused on the conduct of war between nations, the treatment of prisoners, the protection of civilians in occupied territory, the prohibition of specific weapons. But what law covered the systematic murder of millions of your own citizens? What precedent addressed the planning and execution of aggressive war itself, the decision to invade peaceful neighbors without provocation? Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, a United States Supreme Court justice, understood that this trial would either establish new principles of international law or collapse into mere vengeance disguised as justice. His opening statement laid out the stakes with remarkable clarity. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. Consider the architecture of the case Jackson built. He could not simply point to specific criminal acts and demand punishment. He had to establish that planning aggressive war constituted a crime, the first time in history such a claim would be made. He had to argue that ordering or permitting atrocities, even when those orders came through military chains of command, created personal criminal responsibility for leaders. He had to prove that following superior orders provided no defense when those orders were manifestly illegal. Medieval principles of command responsibility, dormant for centuries, were resurrected and transformed. If you command forces that commit atrocities, and you knew or should have known about those crimes, you bear legal responsibility. This doctrine, refined through the Nuremberg trials, would reshape military command structures worldwide, creating obligations that every general today still navigates. The prosecution presented 100,000 documents, Each one had been selected from millions of pages captured in German government files, carefully organized to build a comprehensive narrative of Nazi Germany's 12-year existence. Orders signed by the defendants. Minutes from meetings where they planned invasions and discussed the fate of conquered populations. Communications revealing their knowledge of concentration camps and execution squads. But documents alone, however damning, could not convey the full scope of what had occurred. The prosecution showed films captured by both Allied forces and the Germans themselves. Footage from liberated concentration camps played on screens in the courtroom. Piles of skeletal corpses, living prisoners who seemed more dead than alive. Crematoria still warm from their final operations. The gas chambers disguised as showers. Spectators vomited. Some defendants watched impassively, their faces revealing nothing. Others turned away, unable or unwilling to witness what had been done in their names. Göring claimed the films were propaganda, Allied fabrications designed to prejudice the court. This defense collapsed when prosecutors presented German documents meticulously recording every aspect of the killing process. The construction contracts for crematoria, the invoices for Zyklon B gas, the transport schedules that moved millions to their deaths, witnesses testified. Survivors of concentration camps described the selection process at Auschwitz, where a pointed finger meant immediate death or temporary reprieve for slave labor. Residents of occupied territories recounted collective reprisals. Entire villages burned, all male inhabitants executed in response to partisan attacks. Former Nazi officials, seeking reduced sentences, turned against their superiors and provided insider accounts of decision-making at the highest levels. The accumulation of evidence created a weight that seemed to compress the air in the courtroom. You could document individual atrocities, this massacre, that execution, but how do you convey the systematic nature of what occurred? How do you make comprehensible the murder of 6 million Jews, the killing of 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, the deaths of countless civilians in occupied territories? The prosecution used statistics, but numbers at this scale ceased to carry meaning. 6 million is not 6 million individuals with names and families and dreams. It becomes an abstraction, a figure too large for the human mind to truly grasp. So prosecutors alternated between the vast scale and the intimate particular. Here is the statistical evidence of systematic murder. And here is one child, separated from her mother at Auschwitz, never seen again. One story the mind can hold. Even when millions overwhelm comprehension, the defense fought with desperate brilliance. 24 defendants meant 24 defense attorneys, each seeking to distinguish their client from collective guilt, to establish individual innocence, or at least reduced culpability within the larger machinery of the Nazi state. Dr. Otto Stamer, defending Göring, achieved what seemed impossible in the trial's early days. He nearly saved his client from immediate conviction through a discovery that sent the courtroom into 3 days of chaos. During cross-examination of a French witness, Stamer noticed a discrepancy. The English translation of testimony differed substantially from what the witness had said in French. He demanded review of the interpretation systems, and investigators discovered systematic errors in translation between multiple languages. Documents, originally written in German, translated to French, then English, sometimes to Russian, had accumulated distortions like a message whispered through too many intermediaries. In one case, should be considered became must be implemented, a subtle shift that transformed a tentative suggestion into a direct order. In another, hostile populations became Jewish populations, adding specificity that did not exist. In the original text, the tribunal halted proceedings, while linguists reviewed thousands of documents and testimony pages. Defense attorneys seized this opening, challenging the reliability of every translated piece of evidence. If some translations were flawed, they argued, how could the court trust any of them? The prosecution's carefully constructed documentary evidence seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. It took 3 days of meticulous review to sort accurate translations from flawed ones, to establish that while errors existed, the vast majority of documents had been rendered faithfully. But those 3 days demonstrated something crucial. The trial would not be a mere show of victor's justice. The defendants had rights. Their attorneys could challenge evidence. Procedural fairness would be maintained even in judging men accused of unprecedented crimes. Each defendant's fate ultimately depended on documentary threads, the thinnest lines of evidence connecting them to specific orders, specific knowledge, specific crimes. The prosecution had to prove not just that atrocities occurred, but that these particular men bore legal responsibility for them. For Keitel and Jodl, the evidence proved overwhelming. As chiefs of staff who signed orders implementing Hitler's directives, their signatures appeared on documents ordering executions of commandos captured behind German lines, establishing collective reprisal policies that killed thousands of civilians, implementing the Commissar order that mandated execution of Soviet political officers rather than their treatment as prisoners of war. They could not claim ignorance. The documents bore their names. Göring presented a different challenge. As Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, he held enormous power, but much of his actual authority had waned by the war's end. Could he be held responsible for crimes committed after Hitler had marginalized him? The prosecution argued yes, establishing that command responsibility extends beyond the moment of losing favor, that having established policies and systems that enabled atrocities, Göring remained culpable for their continuation even after his direct influence diminished. The trial revealed patterns through statistical analysis, though these numbers were never presented explicitly to the jury. Staff officers received lighter sentences than field commanders who had directly implemented criminal orders. Luftwaffe generals faced more lenient treatment than their army counterparts, reflecting both the air war's distance from atrocities committed on the ground and perhaps unconscious bias favoring one form of military service over another. Those who could demonstrate active opposition to Hitler's most criminal directives received consideration. Those who had enabled or enthusiastically supported them found no mercy. Defense attorneys constructed elaborate arguments about the nature of military duty, the impossibility of refusing orders in a totalitarian system, the distinction between waging war and committing crimes during warfare. Some of these arguments carried moral weight. Officers in modern militaries face genuine dilemmas about when following orders becomes complicity in evil. But the prosecution countered with evidence of choices made. Instances where other officers had refused criminal orders and faced consequences less severe than death, relief of command, reassignment, career stagnation, but not execution. The trial established that claiming ignorance required actual ignorance, not willful blindness. That following orders provided no defense when those orders violated fundamental principles of humanity so obvious that any reasonable person would recognize them as criminal. That professional military duty did not absolve commanders of moral responsibility for how they executed their functions. Imagine sitting in that courtroom, day after day, as this vast tapestry of evidence unfolded. Each session added threads to a pattern that depicted the systematic transformation of a modern state into a murder machine. The defendants sat through months of testimony, detailing their own involvement, listening to their words quoted back to them, seeing their signatures on documents they could not deny having signed. Some maintained defiant pride. Göring insisted throughout the trial that he had served Germany loyally, that he would do the same again if given the chance, that history would vindicate his actions. Others, like Albert Speer, adopted strategies of partial confession, acknowledging general awareness of crimes while denying specific knowledge that would connect them directly to murder. A few, including Hans Frank, Hitler's governor of occupied Poland, seemed to genuinely break under the weight of evidence. offering confessions that mix self-justification with acknowledgement of monstrous guilt. The courtroom became a theater in the deepest sense, a place where humanity confronted itself, where the question of how civilization could produce such barbarism demanded answers that might prevent repetition. Every aspect of the proceedings was designed to establish legitimacy, to demonstrate that this judgment came not from mere revenge, but from principles that could be applied universally. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts arrived like hammer blows. The judges, representatives from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had deliberated for weeks. Their decision required consensus across 4 nations, with different legal traditions, different philosophies of justice, different political interests. That they reached agreement testified to the overwhelming nature of the evidence. 11 defendants heard the words, "death by hanging." Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and 7 others would face execution. 7 received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted, evidence against them proving insufficient to support conviction, demonstrating that the tribunal had maintained standards of proof even in judging defeated enemies. Wilhelm Keitel's final words echoed through the courtroom with tragic irony. "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." He was led away, returned to the cell where he would wait for 16 days until execution. On October 16, 1946, at 1:16 in the morning, Keitel walked to the gallows erected in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. He wore his uniform, stripped of all decorations, bearing only his name. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. Witnesses reported that Keitel maintained military bearing to the end, standing at attention as the trapdoor opened beneath him. Goering cheated the hangman. Hours before his scheduled execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule he had somehow concealed throughout months of imprisonment. Whether he had it hidden on his person, or whether someone provided it, remained a mystery that investigators never solved. His body was discovered at 2:20 in the morning, cold but not yet rigid. In death as in life, he sought to control his own fate, to deny his enemies the satisfaction of execution. The remaining 9 condemned men, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and 6 others, hanged between 1:11 and 2:45 on the morning of October 16th. Their bodies were photographed for identification purposes, then cremated. The ashes, according to official reports, were scattered in an unnamed river so that no grave could become a shrine for future Nazi sympathizers. The Nuremberg trials established principles that resonate through every subsequent war crimes prosecution. The concept that waging aggressive war constitutes a crime against peace. The principle that crimes against humanity can be prosecuted, regardless of whether they violated the domestic laws of the country where they occurred. The doctrine of command responsibility that holds military leaders accountable for atrocities committed by forces under their authority. The rejection of superior orders as an absolute defense. These principles, extracted from the trials of 24 men, became the foundation of modern international humanitarian law. They informed the Geneva Conventions revised in 1949. They provided the legal framework for tribunals addressing atrocities in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cambodia. They guide the International Criminal Court established in 2002. Every military academy in the world now teaches these principles to officers who must navigate the moral complexities of command. But the trial also revealed uncomfortable truths. Justice at this scale can never be complete. Thousands more Germans bore responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime, concentration camp guards, bureaucrats who processed deportation orders, police officers who rounded up victims, industrialists who profited from slave labor. Most would never face trial. Many would return to ordinary life in post-war Germany, their participation in atrocity unpunished, sometimes even unacknowledged. The 24 defendants at Nuremberg represented a selection, chosen for their prominence, their decision-making authority, the documentary evidence that connected them to specific crimes. They stood in for a much larger system of complicity that the Allies lacked resources and perhaps will to fully prosecute. Perfect justice remained impossible, but the trial established that some justice, however incomplete, was both necessary and achievable. Standing in courtroom 600 today, preserved as a museum, you can almost feel the weight of those 218 days. The room seems smaller than it appears in photographs, more intimate than you would expect for a trial that changed the world. But that intimacy served the trial's purpose. The defendants could see the evidence projected on screens. Witnesses testifying could look directly at the men they accused. Justice required this proximity, this inability to hide behind distance or abstraction. The theater of justice at Nuremberg demonstrated that even the highest-ranking military officers, even those who commanded armies and shaped the course of history, remained subject to moral law. That professional expertise provides no immunity from responsibility. That "I was following orders" cannot excuse participation in crimes so fundamental that they violate the basic compact of human civilization. The verdicts that fell that October day established a new reality. Eagles, having fallen, could fall farther still. There are moments when moral certainty collides with strategic necessity, and the world discovers that its principles are negotiable after all. By 1950, just 5 years after Nuremberg's verdicts, the Cold War had reversed every calculation about justice and redemption. The transformation began with mathematics. Soviet tanks massing along the Iron Curtain numbered in the thousands. The Red Army maintained divisions across Eastern Europe, forces that could reach the Rhine in days if war erupted. Western intelligence agencies, trying to predict Soviet intentions and capabilities, confronted an uncomfortable truth. They knew remarkably little about how their new enemy actually fought. But someone did know. The Wehrmacht generals, who had fought on the Eastern Front for 4 years, possessed knowledge that no amount of intelligence gathering could replicate. They understood Soviet tactics, logistics, command philosophy. They had seen how Red Army units deployed in attack and defense, where vulnerabilities existed, what strategies succeeded and failed. This knowledge, written in the blood of millions across the vast spaces between Berlin and Moscow, suddenly became the most valuable commodity in the emerging Cold War. In a classified facility near Frankfurt, American intelligence officers made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 5 years earlier. They sat across a table from General Reinhard Gehlen, who had commanded the Fremde Heer Ost, Foreign Armies East, Hitler's primary intelligence service focused on the Soviet Union. Gehlen offered a simple transaction. His entire network, 4,000 trained agents with contacts throughout Eastern Europe. In exchange for immunity and operational funding, the price was precise. $35 million, adjusted to 1950 values, to reconstitute his spy network under American control. Complete immunity from prosecution for himself and everyone in his organization, regardless of what crimes they might have committed during the war. And recognition, not as a defeated enemy, but as a valued partner in the struggle against communism. American officials accepted. The Gehlen Organization, as it became known, formed the foundation of West Germany's intelligence service and provided crucial information to the CIA. Throughout the Cold War, whether the information was actually valuable or whether Gehlen simply told his new masters what they wanted to hear remained a subject of debate for decades. But the deal established a template, expertise purchased with forgotten graves and buried files. The rehabilitation happened through precise formulas. Generals with Eastern Front experience received priority. The more time an officer had spent fighting Soviets, the more useful he became, regardless of other complications in his record. Combat commanders proved more valuable than staff officers. Specialists in armored warfare, winter operations, and defensive tactics commanded particular interest. Adolf Hitler provided the perfect case study. He had served on the Wehrmacht General Staff, helping plan Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that killed 27 million Soviet citizens. His tactical knowledge was undeniable. His complicity in aggressive war seemed equally clear. Yet by 1957, he commanded West Germany's new military forces. By 1961, he served as chairman of NATO's Military Committee, the highest military position in the Western Alliance. How does such a transformation occur? Through careful choreography and strategic amnesia. New uniforms designed without Nazi insignia. Service records rewritten to emphasize professional competence while omitting ideological loyalty. Vetting processes that asked about technical skills rather than wartime conduct. References to the Wehrmacht instead of Nazi forces, to the war rather than the war of aggression. Hans Speidel, Rommel's former chief of staff, traveled a similar path. He had participated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, which provided a veneer of resistance that obscured other aspects of his service. By the mid-1950s, he commanded NATO ground forces in Central Europe, defending the same territories he had once helped conquer. His officers included many who had served under him in the Wehrmacht, creating an institutional continuity between Hitler's military and NATO's defensive forces. The Germans themselves proved eager partners in this resurrection. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer understood that West Germany's integration into Western defense structures required rehabilitating military officers. The new Bundeswehr needed experienced commanders, and those commanders overwhelmingly came from Wehrmacht ranks. There simply existed no alternative pool of German military talent, behind closed doors, in facilities classified for decades. Former Wehrmacht generals taught American officers everything they knew about fighting Soviets. The curriculum covered tactical lessons, how Red Army units maneuvered, what formations they preferred, how to recognize their preparations for offensive operations. It included strategic assessments, where Soviet logistics could be disrupted, which geographic features provided defensive advantages, how to exploit the rigid Soviet command structure that discouraged initiative at lower levels. The sessions were detailed and practical. How to fight in Russian winter, maintaining equipment and morale when temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. How to conduct mobile defense across the vast spaces of Eastern Europe. How to interpret Soviet communications patterns and predict their intentions. Which bridges and rail lines were critical to Soviet offensive operations. Where to position forces for maximum effectiveness with minimum strength. These lessons, extracted from men who had killed millions while learning them, became doctrine for American and NATO forces. The knowledge transfer was complete and unapologetic. Moral considerations yielded to strategic imperatives. The Cold War required experts on Soviet warfare, and the Wehrmacht had produced such experts through 4 years of brutal combat. By 1955, 44 former Nazi generals wore NATO uniforms. Some had been convicted at Nuremberg or other tribunals and served reduced sentences before release. Others had never faced trial, their cases dismissed or ignored in the rush to rearm West Germany. A few had been explicitly acquitted, but found that acquittal, combined with valuable expertise, opened doors to renewed military careers. The psychological adjustment varied by individual. Some genuinely embraced the new cause, seeing defense of Western Europe against Soviet aggression as redemption for their service to Hitler. They convinced themselves that they had always really fought against communism, that the war crimes and atrocities were unfortunate excesses committed by others, that their professional military service could be separated from the evil purposes it had served. Others maintained private reservations while accepting the opportunities offered. They needed employment, status, purpose. The Bundeswehr and NATO provided all three, along with tacit agreement not to examine too closely what had happened between 1939 and 1945. These men served competently if not enthusiastically, training a new generation of officers in the tactical and operational lessons learned through catastrophic experience. A few seem to feel nothing at all, no remorse for the past, no commitment to the present cause, simply professional soldiers executing whatever mission their current employers required. They had fought for Hitler. Now they fought against Stalin. The cause mattered less than the exercise of military skill, the satisfaction of command, the comfortable superiority of professional expertise. The resurrection created bitter ironies. Officers who had brutalized occupied populations now defended those same nations against Soviet threats. Generals who had planned aggressive wars now prepared defensive operations. Men who had served totalitarianism now protected democracy, at least in theory. The Western Alliance, fighting to preserve freedom and human dignity, employed experts whose prior service had involved systematic violation of both. Defenders of these policies argued necessity. The Soviet threat was real and immediate. Western Europe's defense required experienced commanders. Germany's integration into NATO served crucial strategic and political purposes. Using Wehrmacht veterans, however morally complicated, protected millions from Soviet aggression. The choice was pragmatic rather than principled, but pragmatism sometimes serves justice better than rigid morality. Critics saw moral bankruptcy. Nations that had prosecuted war crimes at Nuremberg now employed war criminals as advisors and commanders. Justice sacrificed to convenience. Principles abandoned when they became expensive. The message sent to future potential war criminals: commit atrocities if you must, but develop valuable expertise so you'll prove useful afterward. Both perspectives held truth. The Cold War created impossible choices, situations where every option carried moral costs. Western leaders chose to pay those costs, calculating that preventing Soviet expansion justified rehabilitating Nazi generals. Whether history will judge that calculation as wise or damning remains unclear even today. What is certain? The strange resurrection transformed men marked for execution or imprisonment into valued members of the Western Alliance. Eagles that had fallen from the gallows rose again, wearing different uniforms, but carrying the same knowledge, the same skills, the same memories of what they had done and seen. Their expertise, purchased with deliberate forgetting, helped shape the military institutions that kept peace in Europe for decades. The price of that peace, paid in compromised principles and rehabilitated criminals, seemed acceptable to those who made the bargain. Whether it should have seemed acceptable remains among the most difficult questions the Cold War poses to history's judgment. While some generals traded testimony for freedom, and others found resurrection through Cold War necessity, a third group chose a different path entirely. They vanished into carefully constructed shadows, disappearing along routes that history would later call rat lines. The escape networks operated with surprising sophistication. Odessa, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, the organization of former SS members, functioned through Catholic monasteries, Red Cross offices, and sympathetic officials who believed that Christian mercy required helping defeated soldiers escape prosecution. Whether formal Odessa actually existed as a unified organization remains debated. What is certain, networks existed that spirited Nazi officers across borders with systematic efficiency. The routes followed predictable geography. From Germany to Austria, where American occupation forces proved less vigilant than Soviet or British counterparts. From Austria to Italy, where the Vatican's Pontifical Commission for Assistance harbored complex attitudes toward Nazi fugitives, condemning their crimes while offering humanitarian aid to refugees regardless of their wartime service. From Italian ports to South America, where several governments welcomed German immigrants, especially those with technical skills or transferable wealth. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim traveled this route with remarkable audacity. He had commanded panzer divisions in North Africa, fighting Rommel's battles after the Desert Fox departed. American forces captured him in Tunisia in 1943. He spent 2 years in prisoner of war camps before release seemed imminent. But investigators began examining his role in anti-partisan operations in occupied France, finding evidence of reprisal executions that violated military law. Von Arnim disappeared from a British detention facility in 1947. His escape utilized the classic pattern: civilian clothes provided by sympathetic guards, documents identifying him as a Croatian refugee, transport hidden in a commercial truck carrying fruit to market. He reached Italy, then Syria, where the government employed several former Wehrmacht officers as military advisors. From Damascus, he sailed to Buenos Aires with papers declaring his occupation as engineer. His nationality as Croatian, his past as anything but what it actually was. In Argentina, von Arnim joined 14 other Wehrmacht generals who met monthly in a German restaurant on Avenida Corrientes. These gatherings combined nostalgia and business planning. The generals discussed their campaigns, debating what had gone wrong, where victories might have been achieved. They also planned commercial ventures, launching import-export firms and construction companies with capital mysteriously transferred through Swiss banks. The mathematics of escape followed patterns intelligence agencies learned to recognize. Generals with technical expertise found sanctuary more easily than those known primarily for combat commands. A single rocket scientist equaled 3 infantry commanders in terms of asylum value. Nations competing with the Soviet Union sought German engineers, physicists, chemists. Officers whose skills lay purely in tactics and strategy proved harder to place. Some lived openly under their own names, protected by host governments that valued their expertise. General Otto Ernst Remer operated a concrete company in Egypt while advising President Nasser's military on defensive operations against Israel. His presence in Cairo was no secret. Israeli intelligence knew exactly where he lived, but Egyptian protection made him untouchable. And the complex politics of Cold War alliances meant Western nations showed little interest in pursuing his extradition. Others maintained elaborate deceptions for decades. General Heinrich Müller, Gestapo chief, officially died in Berlin during the final battle for the city. His body was never found, which was unremarkable given the chaos and mass burials of May 1945. But CIA files declassified decades later suggested he reached Switzerland, then Panama, where he lived under an assumed identity until 1973. The evidence remains circumstantial: reported sightings, financial transactions that might have been his, testimony from individuals claiming to have seen him. Proof sufficient for historical certainty never emerged. The hunts continued through decades as multiple organizations pursued different fugitives for different reasons. Israeli agents sought those responsible for the Holocaust, conducting operations that sometimes resulted in kidnapping and transport to Israel for trial. The most famous case, Adolf Eichmann's capture in Buenos Aires in 1960, demonstrated Mossad's reach and determination. But Eichmann was not a general, merely a mid-level bureaucrat who had organized deportations. The military commanders proved more elusive. Soviet operatives pursued Wehrmacht generals who had commanded on the Eastern Front, seeking either justice for Soviet citizens or intelligence about current NATO operations. Some generals disappeared from South American exile, their fates unknown. Whether they died naturally, were assassinated, or were spirited behind the Iron Curtain for interrogation remained speculation without proof. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal maintained exhaustive files documenting alleged sightings and leads. Wiesenthal's archive recorded 1,700 reported sightings of missing generals across 6 continents. A general supposedly seen in Paraguay, another reported running a business in Spain, a third allegedly working as a military advisor in Indonesia. Each report required investigation, cross-referencing, attempts at verification. Only 43 of those 1,700 sightings resulted in positive identification. The rest dissolved into dead ends and mistaken identity. The world contained many German-speaking men of appropriate age. In dim light at distance, through the distortions of memory, ordinary immigrants became suspected war criminals. The few confirmed discoveries proved how difficult the hunt truly was. Some generals died quietly, their deaths recorded under false names on certificates filed in languages they had learned in exile. A Croatian engineer buried in Buenos Aires, a Spanish businessman interred in Madrid, a Swiss factory manager cremated in Zurich. Only later, sometimes decades later, did researchers discover the true identities beneath the manufactured biographies. The Vatican's role in these escapes generated controversy that persists today. Catholic officials argued they provided humanitarian assistance to refugees, that Christian mercy required helping those fleeing prosecution regardless of their past actions. Critics noted that this mercy seemed selectively applied, generous toward Nazi fugitives, less so toward their victims. The Church maintained it did not knowingly assist war criminals, only refugees who claimed persecution, that many of those refugees had legitimate reason to fear prosecution, went unacknowledged in official Church positions. Red Cross officials issued thousands of travel documents to German refugees, often based on nothing more than verbal testimony about identity and background. The organization later admitted these procedures enabled fugitives to obtain legitimate papers under false names. But in the chaos of post-war Europe, with millions of displaced persons seeking documentation, careful verification proved impossible. Some officials likely knew they assisted war criminals. Others simply processed applications without investigating too carefully who stood before them. The Swiss banking system provided crucial infrastructure for escape. Wehrmacht generals who had plundered occupied territories deposited proceeds in numbered accounts that Swiss law protected with legendary secrecy. These accounts funded new lives in exile, providing capital for businesses and comfortable lifestyles. Attempts to trace these financial flows met resistance from banks citing privacy laws and lack of documentation. Most accounts remain sealed, their contents and ownership unknown. Consider what this meant for the generals who vanished successfully. They left behind everything, families sometimes, certainly homes and possessions, the social world that had defined them. They arrived in foreign countries knowing little of local languages or customs. They built new identities from fabricated documents and rehearsed stories. Every interaction with authorities risked exposure. Every fellow German immigrant might recognize them. They lived with permanent awareness that discovery meant arrest, extradition, trial, likely execution. Some cracked under the psychological pressure. General Walter von Reichenau supposedly died of a stroke in 1942. But persistent rumors suggested he survived and fled to South America, where he killed himself in the early 1950s, after years of looking over his shoulder. The evidence is thin, but the pattern fits others who found that life as a fugitive proved unbearable. Others adapted with remarkable resilience. They learned new languages, adopted new manners, created plausible histories that explained their German accents and military bearing. They became successful businessmen, respected members of expatriate communities, sometimes even local celebrities known for their engineering expertise or business acumen. Their pasts remained buried beneath years of careful construction, layers of deception so complete that even their children sometimes did not know the truth. The children of these fugitives inherited complex legacies. Some grew up believing their father's stories, that Papa had been a simple soldier, that he fled because Victor's justice would not distinguish between combat service and war crimes. Others discovered the truth gradually, finding documents or photographs that revealed identities their fathers had hidden. The psychological damage of learning your father was not who he claimed, that the life you knew was built on lies, that the man who taught you values had himself committed atrocities. This damage rippled through generations. The vanished generals represented a particular kind of failure in the pursuit of justice. They had committed crimes serious enough to warrant escape, possessed resources sufficient to enable it, and benefited from networks willing to facilitate it. Their successful disappearances mocked the principles established at Nuremberg, demonstrating that accountability remained contingent on capture. Yet even in exile, their influence faded. Whatever they had been during the war, whatever power they had wielded, diminished into nostalgia and bitterness. They met in restaurants to relive past glories that the world had judged criminal. They advised minor governments on military matters of decreasing relevance. They died far from the countries they had served, buried under names not their own. Their actual achievements and crimes known to fewer people each year. The rat lines eventually dried up as Cold War priorities shifted and international cooperation on war crimes improved. By the 1960s, escaping prosecution became far more difficult. By the 70s, most missing generals had died of natural causes, their locations never confirmed. The hunt continued, driven by determination that justice delayed should not become justice denied. But the targets grew fewer each year. Today, the few remaining mysteries attract researchers and amateur historians who sift through archives seeking clues about who reached where and when. DNA analysis of bodies in South American graves sometimes confirms identities, adding footnotes to history. But the larger truth remains. Some who deserved judgment escaped it entirely, living out their years in sunshine, far from the ruins they had helped create. As the 1960s dawned, aging generals waged their last campaign, not for territory or resources, but for something more precious and elusive: control over how history would remember them. The memoir wars began in earnest. Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as the Wehrmacht's most brilliant strategist, published Lost Victories in 1955. The book sold 2 million copies across multiple languages, establishing patterns that other generals would eagerly follow. Manstein's narrative emphasized tactical brilliance and strategic vision, while conveniently omitting inconvenient truths. His signature on orders to execute Soviet commissars, his knowledge of Einsatzgruppen operations in his command area, his willing participation in Hitler's war of extermination disguised as military necessity, the formula proved irresistible to publishers and readers alike. Western audiences, increasingly focused on the Cold War, wanted to understand how Germany had nearly defeated the Soviet Union. They craved insights into military strategy, accounts of dramatic campaigns, explanations of how close Hitler came to victory. They proved far less interested in moral accounting for atrocities committed during those campaigns. Publishing houses paid enormous advances for manuscripts promising revelations about Hitler's final days or explanations of Germany's near victory. Six-figure sums in 1960s currency bought memoirs from generals eager to shape their legacies. The economic incentive aligned perfectly with psychological need. These men desperately wanted vindication, and publishers offered lucrative platforms for their justifications. Each general's version contradicted others, creating a bibliographic battlefield where reputation replaced actual territory as the objective. Manstein blamed Hitler's interference for defeats. Heinz Guderian blamed Manstein's caution for missed opportunities. Field Marshal Kesselring blamed both for failures in Italy. The Wehrmacht High Command, having lost the actual war, now fought proxy battles through competing memoirs, each author establishing his brilliance while explaining away his failures through others' incompetence. The biological clock created urgency. Every month brought obituaries, another general dead, taking secrets to marked or unmarked graves. Death's approach concentrated minds wonderfully. Men who had maintained silence for years suddenly felt compelled to tell their versions before time ran out. The result: a flood of memoirs, interviews, documentary participation, anything that might preserve favorable narratives for posterity. Hans Guderian spent his final years in furious correspondence, writing approximately 8,000 letters, defending his reputation against historians who documented his cooperation with SS operations. He had pioneered armored warfare tactics that revolutionized military operations. This achievement, he insisted, should define his legacy, not his willing facilitation of criminal policies in occupied Soviet territories. His letters grew increasingly desperate as evidence accumulated, each new revelation requiring new explanations, new distinctions between what he knew and what he chose not to know. The defense strategies followed predictable patterns. First, deny personal involvement in atrocities. If evidence made denial impossible, claim ignorance of criminal nature. If documents proved knowledge, argue that refusal meant death or relief of command that would have made no difference. If that failed, invoke the chaos of war, the impossible choices commanders faced. The distinction between following orders and moral culpability. Some sought redemption through confession, though confession itself became a kind of strategy. General Walter Warlimont admitted on his deathbed that he knew about the Holocaust, but chose career over conscience. This admission came after decades of denials, conveniently timed when he faced no legal consequences. Whether it represented genuine moral reckoning or calculated legacy management remained unclear. Perhaps it represented both. The human capacity for self-deception means genuine remorse and strategic calculation can coexist in the same confession. Others maintained innocence until their final breaths. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring died in 1960, insisting his execution of Italian hostages followed legitimate military law. The ratio he applied, 10 Italians killed for each German soldier killed by partisans, exceeded any reasonable interpretation of military necessity. But Kesselring never wavered, never acknowledged that ordering such killings constituted a war crime. He died believing himself a soldier who had served honorably in impossible circumstances. The children inherited impossible legacies. They grew up as sons and daughters of famous commanders, sometimes learning only gradually about their father's crimes. The psychological burden varied dramatically based on individual circumstances and personal character. Manfred Rommel became Stuttgart's beloved mayor, serving from 1974 to 1996. He navigated his father's complicated legacy by acknowledging both Erwin Rommel's military achievements and his participation in Nazi Germany's wars. Manfred neither defended everything his father did nor condemned him entirely. He represented a generation trying to understand their parents without either denying their crimes or reducing them to monsters incapable of love or virtue. Wolf Rüdiger Hess took a different path. He spent more than 50 years claiming his father, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was murdered at Spandau prison rather than having committed suicide. Wolf Rüdiger created a career from conspiracy theories about his father's death, writing books and giving interviews that portrayed Rudolf Hess as a misunderstood peace seeker rather than an architect of Nazi policy. The psychological need to believe in his father's innocence apparently outweighed any evidence to the contrary. The third generation, grandchildren born after the war, faced yet different challenges. They had no personal memories of their grandfathers as young men, knew them only as elderly figures, if at all. Yet they inherited reputations that shaped their lives in ways both visible and subtle. Some hired researchers to investigate family histories, seeking truth about men they never knew, but whose actions affected how people treated them. These investigations sometimes revealed horrifying details. A beloved grandfather who told stories about the war, omitting his command of units that killed civilians. A family hero whose military decorations were earned through operations that constituted war crimes. The discovery process meant confronting painful truths that earlier generations had buried beneath selective memory and strategic silence. The German people collectively struggled with these questions. The immediate post-war years emphasized rebuilding and economic recovery. By the 1960s, a younger generation began demanding fuller accounting of what their parents and grandparents had done. Student movements challenged former Nazis who held prominent positions in government, education, and business. The confrontation between generations became a defining feature of German society. Historians contributed to this reckoning by publishing studies based on captured documents. The Wehrmacht's systematic involvement in atrocities became impossible to deny as researchers revealed orders signed, knowledge documented, willing participation proven through the Germans' own meticulous records. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, that the military fought honorably while the SS committed crimes, collapsed under documentary evidence. The generals' memoirs, despite their self-serving distortions, provided raw data for historical analysis. Researchers could compare claims against documentary records, identifying where authors departed from truth to serve their narratives. The very act of lying about the past sometimes revealed more than truth-telling would have. What generals chose to omit or misrepresent indicated what they knew would damage their reputations most. As the 1970s progressed, fewer and fewer Wehrmacht generals remained alive. The youngest officers who reached general rank during the war entered their 70s. Death came increasingly frequently. Each obituary sparked debates about how to remember complicated lives, acknowledging military competence while condemning criminal complicity, recognizing human complexity while maintaining moral clarity about atrocity. Some died in comfort, surrounded by family, their roles in history's greatest crimes fading into abstract knowledge rather than visceral reality. Others died isolated, reputation destroyed, remembered primarily for what they had enabled or committed. A few died still fighting, still trying to convince anyone who would listen that they had been patriots serving their country, that history would eventually vindicate them, that the crimes committed under their command were unfortunate necessities rather than choices they could have refused. The final testimonies. Deathbed confessions. Last interviews, letters opened after death, added complexity to historical record. They revealed men struggling with guilt they could not quite acknowledge, seeking absolution they did not deserve, hoping that partial admissions might redeem wholly compromised lives. The winter testimonies showed humans confronting mortality while trying to justify choices that could not be justified. By the 1980s, nearly all Wehrmacht generals had died. A handful survived into the 1990s, living long enough to see the Cold War end and Germany reunified. They witnessed their host nation grappling with their legacy in ways that would have seemed impossible in the immediate post-war years. Memorials to victims they had helped kill, museums documenting crimes they had facilitated, educational programs ensuring future generations understood what had been done in Germany's name. The last battles over truth continued beyond the generals' deaths. Their descendants, their biographers, historians, supporting or challenging their reputations, all waged campaigns to establish definitive narratives. But historical truth proved resistant to any single telling. The generals' fates remained complex, their lives mixing professional excellence with moral catastrophe in ways that simple judgments could not adequately address. They had shaped history. Now history shaped how they would be remembered, not as they wished, with crimes minimized and achievements emphasized. But as evidence demanded, skilled commanders who served evil purposes, men whose tactical brilliance enabled strategic horror, generals whose careers illustrated how professional competence provides no immunity from moral responsibility. The story of 247 German generals does not end with their deaths. Their collective fate created legal architecture that governs warfare 70 years later, shaping how nations wage war and how commanders face accountability for their choices. The Nuremberg principles, extracted from their trials, became the foundation for every subsequent war crimes prosecution. When Serbian generals faced judgment for atrocities in Yugoslavia during the 1990s, prosecutors cited precedents established at Nuremberg. When Rwandan military leaders stood trial for genocide, the legal framework came directly from principles developed while judging Wehrmacht commanders. The International Criminal Tribunal for Sierra Leone, the Extraordinary Chambers in Cambodia, the International Criminal Court established in 2002, all these institutions rest on foundations built from the judgment of German generals in 1946. Consider what this means. Every military academy in the world now teaches officers that superior orders provides no defense against moral responsibility. The phrase, "I was just following orders," carries no legal weight, no moral credibility. Commanders learn that their professional obligations include refusing criminal orders, regardless of consequences to their careers. This principle, written in the verdicts that condemned Keitel and Jodl, fundamentally altered military command structures worldwide. The command responsibility doctrine emerged directly from Wehrmacht trials. If you command forces that commit atrocities, and you knew or should have known about those crimes but failed to prevent them, you bear legal responsibility. This doctrine means modern generals face prosecution, not just for ordering crimes, but for failing to stop crimes committed by subordinates. The standard of knowledge, should have known, creates obligations to actively investigate and prevent atrocities rather than maintaining willful ignorance. This principle shapes contemporary military operations in profound ways. Commanders establish robust reporting systems to ensure awareness of subordinates' actions. They implement training programs on law of armed conflict. They investigate allegations immediately. They relieve officers who violate rules of engagement. These protective measures stem from understanding that command responsibility can mean prison sentences for generals whose troops commit war crimes they did not personally. Order intelligence agencies still use statistical models developed from studying Wehrmacht generals' choices. The probability matrices created to predict which officers would flee, collaborate, or resist inform contemporary detention policies. When American forces captured Iraqi military commanders in 2003, interrogation strategies drew on templates established when questioning Wehrmacht generals 60 years earlier. The psychological profiles compiled from 4,000 hours of Ashcan interviews created frameworks for identifying potential war criminals before they act. The reintegration of Wehrmacht generals into NATO established protocols for absorbing defeated militaries that guide operations from Iraq to Afghanistan. How do you transform enemies into allies? How do you assess which former adversaries can be trusted with military responsibility? How do you balance the need for experienced commanders against the risk of empowering those whose previous service involved crimes? These questions, first answered when rebuilding German military forces during the Cold War, recur whenever nations attempt post-conflict reconciliation. The memoirs, despite their deliberate distortions, provide invaluable data for understanding how professional officers rationalize serving criminal regimes. Military historians study Manstein's selective memory and Guderian's self-justifications, not because they believe these accounts, but because they reveal psychological mechanisms that enable complicity. How do intelligent, educated people convince themselves that following orders outweighs moral obligation? How does professional identity override conscience? The general's own words, even when lying, illuminate these processes. Ongoing discoveries remind us that history never truly closes its cases. In 2018, a general's diary was found in an attic in Bavaria, providing new insights into Wehrmacht decision-making during the final months of war. In 2020, DNA analysis confirmed the identity of remains buried in Brazil under a false name, solving a mystery about one general's fate that had persisted for 75 years. Archives in former Soviet territories continue yielding documents that clarify which generals knew what about atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. These discoveries matter because they refine our understanding of command responsibility, of how military institutions function during criminal wars, of where individuals could have chosen differently. Each new piece of evidence adds nuance to historical judgment, though rarely in ways that exonerate the generals. More commonly, revelations demonstrate that they knew more, participated more actively, and bore greater responsibility than they claimed in their defenses. The questions their collective story poses remain urgent for every generation. How does professional duty intersect with moral obligation? When military officers receive orders that violate fundamental human rights, what do professional ethics demand? Can expertise be separated from the cause it served? Should generals who demonstrated tactical brilliance while facilitating genocide be honored for their military achievements? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They shape rules of engagement that determine whether soldiers may fire in ambiguous situations. They inform military ethics courses where officers learn to navigate conflicts between orders and conscience. They influence how nations recruit and train commanders, what values military institutions emphasize, how armed forces balance obedience with moral autonomy. The Wehrmacht generals provide case studies in every possible outcome. Some faced execution, demonstrating that defeat in war does not protect from accountability for how war was fought. Some found redemption through cooperation, showing that even compromised individuals can provide valuable service if properly supervised. Some escaped entirely, illustrating the limits of international justice when fugitives find sanctuary. Some died prosperous and comfortable, proving that consequences for atrocity remain frustratingly contingent on circumstances beyond simple guilt or innocence. Modern commanders know that history will judge their choices as harshly as it judged the generals of the Wehrmacht. This knowledge shapes decision-making in ways both visible and subtle. A general hesitates before approving an airstrike with high civilian casualties, aware that such decisions may face legal scrutiny decades later. A colonel refuses orders to use interrogation techniques that approach torture, understanding that following orders will not shield from prosecution. A major reports atrocities committed by subordinates, despite knowing it will damage his career. Because the alternative is complicity, these individual choices, multiplied across millions of military personnel, create institutional cultures that differ dramatically from those that enabled Wehrmacht crimes. Modern militaries emphasize law of armed conflict training. They establish procedures for reporting violations. They prosecute soldiers and officers who commit atrocities. These systems are imperfect. War crimes still occur, accountability remains inconsistent. Powerful nations sometimes shield their personnel from international justice. But the existence of these systems, their codification in international law, their influence on military doctrine worldwide, traces directly to the judgment of German generals in the years following World War II. The legal frameworks established through their trials created the International Criminal Court, which seeks to prosecute individuals for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes regardless of official positions. The court faces enormous challenges. Powerful nations refuse to participate. Enforcement depends on voluntary cooperation. Practical limitations mean most crimes go unprosecuted. But the institution exists, representing humanity's aspiration to hold all leaders accountable for atrocities, not merely defeated enemies. That aspiration originated in Nuremberg, in the decision to try German generals not simply for losing a war, but for how they fought it. The trials declared that aggressive war constitutes a crime, that genocide violates laws transcending national sovereignty, that military commanders bear personal responsibility for atrocities committed under their authority. These principles, controversial in 1946, have become foundational to international humanitarian law. The echo of Wehrmacht generals' fates sounds through contemporary conflicts. When Russian generals face potential prosecution for atrocities in Ukraine, the legal framework being invoked descends directly from Nuremberg. When Syrian commanders are tried in European courts for crimes against humanity, the doctrines applied come from judgments against Keitel and Jodl. When American officers face courts-martial for abuses committed in Iraq or Afghanistan, the principles of command responsibility trace to precedents established when judging Wehrmacht leadership. This represents the profound victory that emerged from the mixed outcomes of individual cases. Some generals escaped, others found redemption. A few died prosperous despite documented crimes. But collectively, their judgment established that military commanders operate under laws that transcend national sovereignty, that professional competence provides no immunity from moral responsibility, that crimes committed during war face accountability even when committed by the victor's enemies. The world has not achieved perfect justice. It likely never will. War crimes continue. Powerful nations still shield their personnel from international prosecution. The gap between law's aspirations and its enforcement remains vast. But the aspiration itself, the insistence that even generals must answer for their crimes, that command provides no sanctuary from moral law, represents genuine progress born from the judgment of 247 Wehrmacht generals. Their story provides no simple lessons. It shows that justice can be both achieved and denied, that expertise can serve both good and evil, that the same individuals can demonstrate competence and commit atrocities, that historical judgment remains perpetually incomplete as new evidence emerges. But perhaps the absence of simple lessons is itself instructive. The moral universe resists simple categorization. The attempt to create justice in the aftermath of catastrophic evil necessarily involves compromises, failures, and successes that defy easy assessment. What remains clear, the collective fate of Wehrmacht generals changed how the world thinks about military responsibility, created legal structures that persist today, and established principles that guide commanders who face impossible choices between duty and conscience. Their judgment, imperfect and incomplete as it was, declared that eagles who fall can fall farther still, that the highest ranks provide no immunity from accountability, that commanding millions offers no defense against moral law, that history judges generals not merely by whether they won battles, but by how they chose to fight them. This judgment echoes through every military headquarters where officers plan operations, every courtroom where war crimes are prosecuted, every classroom where future commanders learn that their profession carries moral obligations transcending orders from superiors. The generals are dead, but the principles extracted from their trials live on, shaping how nations wage war and how commanders face consequences for their choices. In the end, 247 men who commanded armies became something they never intended: teachers. Their lives, their choices, their various fates provide lessons in command responsibility, moral courage, the price of complicity, the limits of following orders, and the persistent human struggle to balance professional duty with moral obligation. These lessons, learned through catastrophic suffering, represent the last service they provided, a service involuntary and unintended, but perhaps more valuable than any they rendered while they still commanded.